So good morning, everybody. So now we are going to talk about infrastructure, why and how. So the topic is absolutely crucial if we talk about development of emerging countries and also installing a more prosperous economy and boosting its ability to adapt to the new global economy and evolution of sciences. Today, I very much welcome three outstanding panelists. First, on my left, Philippe Delleur, who most of you know because he's an active supporter of the Sharing Knowledge Foundation's conferences. Philippe is Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at Alstom, working for Alstom since over 10 years, I think so, and having held various responsibilities in the group, not least heading the operations for Southern Europe and the Mediterranean, and also Alstom International. So we expect Philippe to give us Alstom's experience in providing transport solution, both freight and persons and urban, and also perhaps draw some recipes for success and lessons for the future. Then we have Ulrike Steinhorst, who is a German lawyer and a truly Franco-German or German-French by its education, her education and career. She's been working in holding executive responsibilities with large industrial corporates such as EDF, the German group Degussa, and Airbus Group. And we expect her to bring us the industrialist perspective on reasons for investing in a country and lessons to be learned on how to maximize the positive impact of a commercial and investment relation in an emerging country. And last, we will have Scott Kalb, who is at the extreme left here, which is not a sign of his political views, not at all. And Scott has a long-lasting experience as an asset and portfolio manager. He is here in this meeting because he is the founder and the chairman of the Sovereign Investor Institute, which is a group, an institution which gathers some 245 sovereign wealth funds of the world, all of them weighing something like 25 trillion, I think so. So it's, we're talking about heavy industry here and coming from 70 countries. But more interesting, if any, Scott also is the senior fellow and advisor of the Bretton Woods II initiative, which is an initiative aiming at commit the investors to impact investing and sustainable investing in developing countries. And that's why, in particular, I expect him to give his views on why investors should invest in infrastructure in developing countries and how to address not only the financial risk, but also the non-financial risks which are linked to an investment in infrastructure. Okay, having said this, I would like to set the picture broadly with some ideas. Why is the investment volume growing in financing infrastructure in developing countries, but also in developed countries? Basically because of urbanization. The MENA countries in the early 50s were urbanized at less than 40% of their population, and now they are nearly 80% of the population which is urbanized. And let me recall that an urbanized person needs 5 times more water and sanitation infrastructure than the person who stays at land, and 3 times more energy than a person who stays at land. So just for urbanization, there's huge need of investing in collective facilities such as sanitation, energy providing, but also human capital and so on and so forth. The second reason why to invest in this sector is the ever and fast changing economy. New technologies need infrastructure, even if they are virtual, even if they're not visible, they are needed. And here I would like to give two figures. It has been asserted that, for instance, the 28 countries of the European Union have to invest 3 trillion euros of infrastructure just to adapt to the new economy, and that for the MENA countries, the 10 MENA countries, from the south and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, it should be at least 1 trillion of similar investments to be done in the 20 years to come. So adapting to the new economy has a cost, and this cost is bringing, of course, work and, of course, the mobilization of financial flows. And last, the third and last reason is, which is more the more human one, is that the democratic movement in the Arab countries has shown that there's a legitimate aspiration for better conditions of life. And this has to be heard and served. And again, this passes by infrastructure in education, sanitation, human capital, protection, and so on. Now, the second question is, why bringing the private sector? First of all, because of the volume of what is needed. All the budgets of the countries concerned are under constraints, so we need to mobilize private capital. But that's not enough. The second main reason is that to ensure a smooth development, we need, as it was illustrated in the previous session, the movement of ideas, persons, and services. And for that, mobilizing the private sector brings mobilizing new capital flows, new technologies, and mobilizing new persons for the development of the MENA countries. And this is an accelerator of modernization, far more than just putting money into projects. And the last reason, of course, is to create an ecosystem of local and international firms who commit themselves, be them financiers, be them corporate, be them service providers, lawyers, technicians, engineers, and so on, who commit themselves for the global development of and the balanced development of the country concerned. A good example for this is Morocco, for instance, where you see they have always the same names coming back for industrial development, for service development, for infrastructure development, and so on and so forth, and establishing new links with the local private sector, and thus putting the political personnel under pressure for being long-lasted, committed to a stable but long-lasting development for the country. Okay, having said that, I will propose to begin with Philippe. Philippe will tell us about Alstom's experience and some of the lessons that the various projects that you have carried in MENA, in transport solution, providing transport solution, which are the lessons that you learned from this. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
The issue between public state funding and private funding, the mix between both, and also the issues of governance, for me absolutely key to enhance transport projects in the region of Middle East and Africa. And I will try to give you an overview of rail transport in Middle East and Africa, coming from our experience as a train manufacturer in Alstom. We work all over the world, so we have this capacity to compare the situation here in this region. Globally speaking, the region which is of the interests of the foundation, largely speaking, Mediterranean, but until South Africa and this region of the Middle East. We have to distinguish in rail transport two aspects which are quite different. One is mainline, both for freight and passengers. Another is urban transport. Regarding mainline, is specific about Africa. In Middle East, there is almost no mainline. There used to be, like in Africa, but there is no more. There can be, again, in the future. In the Gulf, there are some projects. I like this map because this map is absolutely misleading. That's the reason why I put it. On the left, you have Africa. On the right, you have India. In both regions, you have exactly the same number of kilometers of tracks, all around the same, 6,500,000. Except that, of course, the form of Africa and India looks like each other. But, of course, India is only, you put India just in the eastern part of Africa. So that's the big difference. That means what? That means that Africa has a very small network of rail inherited from the colonies in a very bad shape. The consequence of which is that it has poor economic parameters. Especially, there is a very low traffic density. To give you some figures, I will not give many figures, but just to give you an idea, except South Africa, where the traffic units per kilometers per year is around 5.8 million, which is something comparable, for example, to Germany. Okay? Morocco also is a country with an important network and with a good traffic density, 4.7 million traffic units per kilometer of tracks in Morocco. But if you take the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, the number is 0.9. And if you compare to other regions in the world, China, for example, the number is 49 million units per kilometer. Russia is 25.2, US 12, and so on. So if low traffic density means very high cost, and so not competitive network for transporting freight. The situation has been a little bit improving at the end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s because, as Henri said, there have been some input of private capitals through concessions. And effectively, since that period, at least the traffic has stabilized. In some concession has increased, while for the railways that were put under private concession, while for the railways that stayed as public owned, the traffic continues to decrease. For example, in Congo, it has continued to increase. In countries like Cameroon or Ivory Coast, it has stabilized or increased. And in these two last examples, also a reason of relatively success, especially in terms of financial and operational performance. One key element was that the infrastructure remained the property of the state, and the concessionaire had to make some investments with fresh private money. But the state was not absolutely put out of the picture. Anyway, during this period, some improvement, but not sufficient. Why? Because mainly there have been over-optimistic expectation of the evolution of the traffic, underestimation of the investment needed to upgrade the network, and undercapitalization of the concessions. What we are seeing more recently during the last years is our new projects, especially in this part in East Africa, mainly linked to mining projects and with a very big, strong Chinese influence and intervention. For example, with Chinese money, which explained the upgrading of tracks in the region in Kenya, Mombasa, the Mombasa port to Nairobi, also the line Addis Abeba, Djibouti, and also in the west, Nigeria. But these lines in the east are linked to, as you know, the famous Chinese project, One Belt, One Road. By the way, this presently now, these days, there is a big summit, as you know, in Beijing between the Chinese government and all the countries interested in this project. And this part of Africa is connected, is the part connected to this project with China. So that was for mainline. For urban transport, Henri has said the main driver for development is, of course, the increasing urbanization. And this shows you a map of the 16 fastest growing cities in Africa. And for all of them, especially for the 5 in green, there is a really big challenge to introduce collective transportation in order to reduce the kind of chaos of traffic because of informal, individual or collective informal transportation that create a complete congestion of these cities. Where that's the situation of Africa, frankly speaking, the improvement is coming more in North Africa and Middle East. I'm going to show you with some slides, and then I will try to show you some elements of best practices that can be taken from these experiences. But first, to show you through some slides some examples of projects that have been successful in the last years with participation of Alstom. So first, in terms of, in all range of transportation, first tramways, which has been a real success in North Africa because we have been able to implement tramways in almost all countries in North Africa, beginning from Tunis, because that was the first city that got it, then Rabat, Casablanca, Alger, and many other cities in Algeria, and also in the Gulf with Doha and first Dubai and Doha. And tramway is really a success because it is very well adapted to the cities, and it creates the possibility for the city to reinvent the urbanization. The introduction of a new way of transport gives the possibility to rethink how the city is built and how the people live, and not only move, but also live in the city. Second examples are metro. Of course, there is one traditional metro in the city, which is Cairo, with a very old participation of Alstom and other French companies. But we are building right now from scratch 3 out of 6 lines in Riyadh. And also we are participating to the extension. We are responsible for the extension of Dubai Metro for the Universal Exhibition of 2020. Istanbul, of course, also. In Africa, the big investment has been made by South Africa, and we have got the biggest contract. We have signed the biggest contract ever for Alstom Life 3 or 4 years ago to build, manufacture, and deliver to South Africa network 600 suburban trains built in South Africa. and then regional trains. And then there are two interest projects, one in Algeria, ongoing, and another one just beginning. And that's I'm quite proud of, and I think this is very interesting in terms of changing our view about what is going on in Africa. For the first time, we will be able to introduce a modern system of transportation in a city in Western Africa, in Dakar, and in an extremely quick way. This project has begun 2 years ago. The idea of the project has begun 2 years ago, and we have signed the contract at the beginning of this year, and we are beginning to execute the project to deliver 15 trains between the center of the city of Dakar to the airport, the new international airport of Dakar, and a new city 35, 40 kilometers outside of Dakar. And then, of course, last but not least, the very high-speed train that we are introducing in Morocco. So to sum up and to conclude, what lessons to learn from these different examples? First, as Henri has said, there is a participation of private companies, but at the same time, and that's the important point to think about what can happen in Jordan or in other countries in the region, remaining a strong participation of the state. There is no transport project able to fly if the state are not inside. Why? Because as far as urban transport is concerned, for passengers, the payment by Scott will I will not be long on that because Scott will develop that much more than myself. This project cannot rely only on the payment, on the fare paid by the customer. Second, there have been a strong support from international financial institutions, either at multilateral level, World Bank, EIB, my dear Henri, and also bilateral institutions. And as an example, France has been extremely involved on most of the projects I showed to you would have not been possible without the support of the French financing. Third, there have been the idea, and I think one good example is the high-speed train in Morocco, to consider the project more globally, not only for itself, but considering the externalities introduced by the project. And this idea of introducing a very high-speed train in Morocco was something very much discussed. It has been a decision made by the king, frankly speaking. We have to say that, but with a very long-term view. And why? The high-speed train is not between Rabat and Casablanca, but between Tanger and Rabat, because Tanger is really the port developing all the region, the north of Morocco, which used to be a region not very much developed so far. So really putting a focus on the port of Tanger and building immediately this new line for passenger, so that the existing line will be dedicated only to freight, really was a very ambitious and a very long-term view, which is something necessary in transport, and I'm sure that all the scientists in the room understand what means long-term in projects. Then the idea of return in terms of industry, and that's the example I've given about Algeria and South Africa. The governments in these two countries have understood that through a transport project, they can bring competencies, they can also create employment, and we have participated to this project by building manufacturing facilities in both countries. And then, just to finalize this example of Dakar, I finish on Dakar, because at the same time as we have been able to participate to this project in 2 years, as I said, at the same time, Abidjan, which really looks like Dakar, has launched a project, same kind of project, suburban train, bringing people from the suburbs to the center, almost the same length, so 35, 40 kilometers. This project has been launched in Ivory Coast 5 years ago and is not yet really flying. Why? Because the Ivory Coast government, at the beginning, and I know now it is changing its mind, and we are helping them to do so, the government thought that the project would be 100% private. And it doesn't work, because no private investor is able to support fully a project like introducing a suburban train in Ivory Coast or in developing countries, but also in developed countries. That's not specific to developing countries. And now the Ivory government is thinking about the right risk sharing between public and private, but this is something that will be developed by my colleagues on the table. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for this presentation, not least because you've tackled most of the topics, and this gives me the opportunity to hand the floor to Ulrike Steinhorst, who will give her perspective. Perhaps we shall have the questions together after we have each of us already.
So I'm going to take you from the sublime to the mundane, and we're going to be talking a bit about the financial side. Just again, a little bit of a background, as Henri was saying. I founded an institute called the Sovereign Investor Institute. So I set this up about 4 years ago. I'm the chairman of the institute now. We have about 245 sovereign funds, and that from 70 countries that participate. The average assets under management at each of these sovereign funds is about $100 billion each. So we have something like, I don't know, $25 trillion of total assets under management. It's truly global, and from all over. So you talk about cooperation and collaboration in the scientific community. We're really talking about collaboration and cooperation in the financial community. I have in our institute we have sovereign wealth funds. How many of you know what a sovereign wealth fund is? Anybody? We do have a few people know. It's okay if you don't. I mean, it's pretty obscure. Sovereign wealth funds are government-owned funds that usually are set up to manage excess reserves. So you're taken out of the central banking reserve system and manage more towards risk assets. In some countries, we have some deficit countries that have set up sovereign wealth funds. But they typically have a mission of managing money to pay for the peoples of their states, their retirement benefits, their education, their health care, their long-term savings, could be ultimately used for unification purposes. So there's a variety of missions, but they're mission-driven organizations. They have capital, they're investing it to make an appropriate risk-adjusted return, not to generate profits for the organization, but in order to meet the liabilities they have for their stakeholders. I also have government pension funds, Social Security funds, central bank reserve funds. So, for example, in our organization, the Central Bank of Jordan is a member of our institute. So is the Central Bank of Israel. So is there's the Social Security Fund of Palestine, the Social Security Fund of Vietnam. We have the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Botswana, of Morocco, the Sovereign Wealth Fund from Angola, Sri Lanka, and then all the European countries, the General Pension Fund of Japan, which is the largest government pension fund in the world at $1.2 trillion on its own. It's pretty extraordinary. So in our institute, we talk about general issues about how to help these guys who are public servants, really, working on behalf of the peoples of their countries, how they can better manage these assets and deal with political problems. I also wear another hat, as Henri said, and I am a senior advisor and a fellow at the Bretton Woods II Institute. And many of you know Bretton Woods, original Bretton Woods, right? Everybody? Bretton Woods? It's great. Okay, so Bretton Woods was set up after World War II to deal with the risks of the financial system. We moved everybody to the gold standard, and to stabilize basically global economy. So Bretton Woods II, the idea is that we need to set up a new system to deal with not just the financial risks, but the non-financial risks we face in the world today, which are pretty substantial. These are long-term risks. You might want to call them sort of not yet financial risks, because ultimately they do become financial. But these are risks regarding sustainability and all different parts of it. So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of some figures, and then we'll talk about some of these issues. And I'm going to be talking about what this aspect, the sovereign community, is doing in infrastructure investing, the capital that's available, and what you need to do to attract this capital. So when you're doing an infrastructure project, how do you finance it? You know, government will typically issue bonds and raise money, sell those bonds and raise money, and then use that to pay for an operator like Alstom or another company to come in. Or sometimes they'll sell equity, or they'll bring in fund managers who will then go out and raise capital. But you've got to basically raise capital. Oh, thank you. You have to raise capital to finance these projects, and that requires a certain number of conditions. And sovereign funds are becoming very important partners in this process around the world. So there are about over 200 sovereign wealth funds and government pension funds with average assets under management of about $100 billion each. The total assets under management of sovereign wealth funds and government pension funds that are allocating to infrastructure today, it's estimated about $12 trillion. We estimate that they allocate between 3 and 5% of their total portfolios to infrastructure, and this is in direct investment in infrastructure projects. So that would be about $360 to $600 billion that's already invested in infrastructure globally. The stewards of long-term capital, infrastructure is it's a perfectly suited asset class for these sovereign wealth funds and government pension funds. These are intergenerational funds, so they're managing money over 30, 40, 50 years. And as you know, infrastructure is a long-term asset class. So to properly finance or to have an infrastructure project, it's a long-term asset. It needs a long-term sustainable solution, and it also needs long-term financing. So for the sovereign funds, they will invest directly in projects, and they also prefer to invest through unlisted funds. They also invest in public funds, or they'll invest in public stocks and bonds. But the demand is growing to invest directly. The one thing you have to understand, though, is that infrastructure investing is very complex, and that becomes a big issue. So let's talk about this a little bit. So first of all, in my institute, I asked 220 sovereign funds last year, what asset class do you want to invest in? And you can see these are all, it's equities and U.S. equities and European and so on, all different asset classes. But the orange there is infrastructure. So clearly it's something that's of big demand in this community. They are interested in investing. This slide shows the FDI, the foreign direct investment of sovereign funds over the last 10 years into infrastructure. And you can see it's been growing pretty consistently. It's about $10 billion a year. So sovereign funds are investing about $50 billion a year just in direct investments. They're investing several $100 billion a year throughout the capital markets. But $50 billion a year in direct investing, and about 20% of that is going straight into infrastructure. In terms of what they're interested in investing in, you can see it's across the board. Airports, ports, they invest in water utility projects, they invest in power distribution, power generation, gas pipelines, transport, telecoms, other is mostly renewable energy. So it's broad interest from them. And where are they, where are they investing? And if you look at this slide, you can see that, they're investing really around the world. A lot of the sovereign funds are based in developing countries, and so they're quite comfortable investing in other developing countries. You can see that they'll invest globally. This is their preferences in Europe, Asia, MENA, North America, emerging markets. Besides, those are the smaller emerging markets, the OECD countries. They're investing all over. Interestingly, over the last 10 years, this slide, the dark portion here shows the investment in developed countries, and the lighter part of the bar shows investment in emerging markets. So it's just interesting, in the last 3 years, we've seen a greater participation overall in investing in infrastructure in emerging markets. This is rather technical. The main point here is just that the sovereign funds, unlike other investors who will mainly invest in infrastructure through a fund, sovereign funds will invest directly. The important point about that is that means they can be good partners, because whenever you have a fund, the fund needs to generate a return to pay the asset management company, which has got a commercial motivation, and then pay the investors in the fund. So to the extent that capital can invest directly in a project, we can lower the overall cost. Here's a sample of some of the sovereign funds that are investing in infrastructure today around the world, or have been for 10 or 20 years, and what their asset size is. So this is a little hard to read, but you can see the top one on this chart is the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, otherwise known as ADIA. They have assets of $770 billion under management. They're investing. The China Investment Corporation, CIC, $750 billion. And then we have the SAFE, which is the Administration of Foreign Exchange in China, $600 billion. The Kuwait Investment Authority, the GIC from Singapore. It goes down the list. So these are huge organizations, and you should not be confused. These are not asset management companies. Remember, they are mission-driven. They've got to meet certain obligations for the peoples of their country, and they're not politically driven. They're managed independently. So these are not strategic funds. The government doesn't tell them what to do. They have to be managed independently to meet their obligations. Here's just a sample of some infrastructure investments by sovereign wealth funds. You can see the top one was one in the U.S. by the GIC of Singapore. It was a $1 billion project. There's one in Australia, and that was done by a consortium. So that's typically what you'll see, a consortium. ADIA and CDPQ from Canada, which is the Canadian, it's the sovereign wealth fund, Castepo de Quebec. And they teamed up with an operator and another asset management company. That was 10 billion Australian dollars. There's one in Turkey in here. It was about close to $1 billion. That was CIC from China and Costco from Singapore, and that was in the shipping industry. So it just gives you an idea. There's a lot going on all the time. What do you have to do to attract investment from sovereign funds into an infrastructure project? Well, I think there's three important components here. The first is it's got to be commercially fit for purpose. You have to remember that these investors need to generate a return. It doesn't have to be huge, but the owners of the infrastructure are the peoples of the country to whom where the infrastructure is being built. Ultimately, they're the users. They own it. The investors are just financing it. So they need to finance it and get their money back at the end and make a return. It doesn't have to be huge. Most of the investors, the sovereign funds, are looking for a mid-single-digit return, maybe mid to high single-digit, so 5 to 6, 7%. And that's reasonable. So you need to design a project that's going to be able to generate a return to attract that investment. And it's not, there's not, having a good commercial discipline is a very sensible proposition. The second thing is you need a strong regulatory and legal framework. There's a lot of risks here. I said that infrastructure is complex. It's a regulated business. When you invest in infrastructure, what you're looking for is a nice, consistent sort of stream of income, a regulated return, and you give up upside. There's no optionality to make a lot of money on the upside in return for that steady stream. But the problem is that there's political risk, there's regulatory risk, we see renegotiation risk. There's been many, many cases in developed countries, let alone emerging markets, in Europe, where governments come in 5 years later and change the terms. And that's very discouraging because it ruins the IRR. So you need. I think Ulrike was talking about this. You need a strong regulatory and legal framework. And finally, you've got to address long-term sustainable or non-financial risks. So I'm working a lot with institutions on this, but you've got to address the concerns of the stakeholders. It's not just the government. So the stakeholders are not just government people, but it's the community, the users. You've got to make sure that when you're doing a project, remember, this is a 30-year project or 20-year project. So what are the labor conditions? What are the environmental issues? What are the health concerns? What are the governance issues? Do we have to deal with, are there some issues of corruption potentially that we need to be concerned about? What are the ethical considerations? These are all very important questions because you don't want to invest in a company or a project that's potentially exploiting its labor force, that's potentially polluting the environment, or that potentially has unethical considerations. So you need to address these because otherwise your project will not be successful over the long term. And increasingly everybody's understanding this and trying to build in such protections into their projects. And we're encouraging investors to make sure that when they make an investment, they're considering not just financial metrics, but also all of these sustainable metrics. You need to have those considerations. And then, there's other things. I won't go into PPPs, but those are important developments that you can make use of. And I note that just a couple of weeks ago, the IFC launched a green bond fund, which was a very important innovation. Green bonds are bonds that meet certain sustainable features. And this is a green bond fund which was set up just for emerging markets. And the interesting thing about it is the IFC is putting in $350 million, but there's an agreement from the private sector to come up with another $2 billion on top of it. And the IFC, so you're getting a multiplier effect. And the IFC is providing technical expertise to help banks all over the emerging world to know what they need to do to issue these green bonds. And these green bonds the financing from them can be used to help provide capital for sustainable infrastructure projects. So this is out there, and I think Jordan, especially with some of its important infrastructure projects, would be a great candidate to potentially participate in that program. So that's it. I think there's a lot of material out there. I was part of a council at the World Economic Forum which wrote a policy blueprint for governments regarding infrastructure investment. And I work with some other government institutions on helping this on the technical side and also financial side. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for this enlightening presentation and explanation, of which I would like to just to summarize, to take one key word. Infrastructure is long-term. It's long-term in terms of creating an asset. It's long-term in terms of finding solutions. It's long-term about committing the partners, be them public, private stakeholders, financiers, and so on, all those who are involved into the project. And lastly, it's long-term for finding the financial tools. What has been done for certain main infrastructure, for instance, in France, that is a concession for 55 years with a return on investment calculated on 45 years, but with financing extended for 10 years, this is insane because it creates a potential problem after 10 years of exploitation, which is not sufficient to have allowed the project to reach its maximum return on investment curve. So long-term, it's an asset. It needs a long-term solution, long-term commitment, long-term finance. Another point I would like to underscore before we begin the discussion between us and with you is that although the figures are very striking, I mean, the amounts of money we were speaking about is calculated in trillions and so on and so forth, there are solutions, there are willingness, and there are availabilities to meet the challenge. Let me give you a figure. I just said that Europe needs to invest 3 trillion in its infrastructure upgrade or deployment. But you have to consider that in Europe you have 16 trillions of private savings under management. So if you compare the two figures, it's reachable. I mean, the percentage dragging private saving into infrastructure investment is feasible unless you are not able, I mean, the framework is not able to define long-term policy commitment and so on and so forth. Okay, now I would like to turn to our speakers to ask them if they have some comments or questions for each other, and then I will turn to the room. Philippe, would you like to open this second part?
Okay. Three remarks. The first one is to consider the importance of the financing, for example, from sovereign funds or other long-term investors regarding infrastructure projects. It happens in a time where banking financing are almost disappearing. The banks don't lend anymore for big projects because they themselves have to face very strict rules regarding their assets and the correspondence between their assets and their loans. And we are seeing the banks much more prudent regarding infrastructure. So there is a real need for other investors. That's why these figures given about the sovereign funds are very important. Second remark is that when there is a need of financing, in fact, there is not only a need of financing. The financing doesn't come only to bring money, but very often also to, and it has been shown with the different examples, to bring advisors, to bring advisors regarding, for instance, the governance. What strikes me is that the number of projects that exist in the paper, but that never fly. Why? Because the authorities don't have the capacity to themselves trigger the project. And that's where the issue of sharing knowledge and best practices is so important. There is no need to reinvent the way to make projects, for example, in the area of transport. We know perfectly in what way a project will work or will not work. But many often you see authorities or decision makers trying to reinvent the different projects. And the third point, maybe that has not been sufficiently strengthened, is the fact that, speaking, you have said that infrastructure are, of course, long-term projects, And when defining the project, you need to think about the whole life of the project. And very often, where the project have difficulties, as you said, is because the issue of how the project will operate, how the maintenance will be realized, are points that are not sufficiently developed when the project is initiated.
Yeah, just a couple of remarks. First, I think Jordan is on a good way. The framework is in place, so we very much hope that Jordan expects from the international community the help that it deserves. The second thing is the example of the airport showed that the international organizations like IFC are extremely helpful to structure a project, to put in place the management the big, huge project deserves. But what is important is that all these stakeholders talk together, speak together, exchange, and are ready to share, and not to follow their individual optimization of their interest. So.
I'm just happy that Philippe is agreed that Alstom is going to build a light rail project from Amman to Petra. Very nice of you to do that. That's just what we need, infrastructure. No, I'm happy to answer any questions. I have questions for our panelists too, but I'd love to hear if you guys have anything.
Okay, let's turn to the floor, please.
Yes, thank you very much. All this was very interesting. I was reflecting that because there is the need to transport both people and goods by railway, most of the traffic, say in Africa, from the days of Vasco da Gama is by sea. And the same thing goes for the Mediterranean since Ulysses, with the exception, of course, of Jordan, which is landlocked. But on the other hand, if you take the Gulf countries, there's been a traditional traffic with India, which was by sail, etc. So I think it's very important to see that the transport by sea is very important, and because it is too slow for people, this is why you need airplanes, and of course, for goods, ponderable goods, you need railways. So I think it's very important to reflect on this. And it is true that in Africa and also in Mediterranean, big cities mean big ports. Another question is about, to say, the lifetime of the project. Well, pension funds do have commitments for the long term. And so in some sense, most of the economists I've heard of say that there is a complementarity between the lifetime of the project and the fact that the pension fund need every year for a long period to have revenue. Thank you.
A comment to your comment, Robert. Long term is crucial. It's key in managing those projects. But long term should be the perspective for all the players, as Philippe and Scott underscored. That is, if one of the player doesn't think long term, it will pejorate the solidity of all the deal. You see, and the weak point by experience in thinking long term is the political. The political are used to think financing and infrastructure through taxes and not through financing, I mean a loan, and they think with a vision which meets their own terms of mandate, you see. So they don't think about the whole life cycle of the project, because what they are interested in is to provide a new service to their population in order to be re-elected, possibly at the end of the game. So that, and So the key issue in ensuring the long term is, first of all, that the political side of the project acquires the knowledge so to have a symmetrical discussion with the private sector, point one, and secondly, has a vision on long term and commit itself for long term, which means that the existing class of politicians commit the following classes, and this is, of course, very, very difficult. Perhaps colleagues would like to...
Yeah, I have something on that. I mean, one of the hard things that we face, it's not just in financing, but in general, is how do you have a disciplined long-term plan under leadership that's often on short-term political cycles? This is a big challenge. Will the commitments be honored? One of the best ways to deal with that is let's try to make everything as transparent as we can. So one of the best ways to finance, say, infrastructure projects is let's use a tariff or a fee. So if you build a road, the users will pay a fee for that road. Or if you build a power plant, you charge an extra 1 cent per megawatt hour, or whatever it is, to the users. And that's very clear, and people should pay for the service. But often it's not very popular. And so as a result, we see that projects will then get financed through some subsidies, and then they're in the balance sheet of the government. That's not very transparent, and then when a new regime comes in, they'll often say, well, wait a second, what is this liability? I didn't agree to this. And then you get renegotiations, and it's a mess. So you need to try to shine a light on these things. And you also need to remember that it's not just about the financial metrics. You must also accommodate, the broader, you must align your goals also with some of the social objectives of your community. Otherwise, the project won't work. The figures I have are that 75% of infrastructure projects are delayed by a minimum of 24 months. A minimum of 24 months because of non-financial risk factors. Labor issues, environmental issues, political issues, governance issues, poor understanding of what's going on in the community, different economic factors. So you must really, and we're learning now that you need to accommodate and you need to build these into your process. And I have a question for you, Philippe. How do you deal with technological risk, the risk of obsolescence? If you're building, a rail project or something else that can take 10 or 20 years, what about the risk that, by the time we're done with the project, our technology that we're deploying may already be on its way to being obsolete?
I will answer this question, but first maybe a remark on what you have said. Okay, I fully agree with you that as much as possible the project should rely on the fees paid by the users. But in some sectors, and it depends on sectors, I mean in energy, that will be the subject for this afternoon, it's enough. As I tried to show, in urban transport, it's impossible. You'll never see a project fully funded by the users. So there is a need of subsidies, and these subsidies can be accepted by the following authorities only if in the counterpart of these subsidies is a real service, improvement of the service, so that the population thinks that there is value for money. That brings me to your question. Well, obsolescence, we generally speaking, we have more and more, we try to be involved during the whole phase of the project, not only during the execution, but also through long-term contract to help the operator. We do not operate them ourselves, our equipment, but we can support the operator to make the maintenance and jointly with him think about the improvements that can be introduced for the technology to follow the new innovations. For example, let's take a metro. Now more and more the metro since the very beginning are designed to be able, if not at the first time to become driverless, because the technology is perfectly exists perfectly and works perfectly, is absolutely proven. But in some countries, there is no wish to pass immediately to driverless metro. So we can offer a metro which is let's say driverless ready, and that will switch to driverless when it is decided that it is suitable for such example.
Yeah.
Let's go to the floor. Voilà.
In the back.
In the back, there were.
Yeah, no, so I've got a mic. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I've got a question for Scott. Is there some kind of minimum size for projects so that the sovereign funds would become interested or even will consider them? Because your figures obviously are very large. You mentioned trillions.
Yes, that's a good point. So they do need scale. They can't. It's too difficult for them to get involved in micro or community level projects. So typically what happens in that case is that somebody will get together and try to bundle together a lot of different smaller projects to create some sort of scale, and then they can invest. I mean, that problem is just, it's simply a matter of resources. I mean, even though these are large organizations and have resources, if you have $100 billion, you just can't make a $10 million investment. It requires the same amount of time and energy and due diligence that a large one. It's such a small fraction of your portfolio that you would have to do thousands of those in order to meet your mandate, and you just can't do it physically. So what you need is somebody to pull those things together, and we've seen good examples of that.
Okay, Rolf.
Well, you stressed several times patience, long-term vision, etc., which, as you also pointed out yourself, is to some extent a contradiction between the wish and the politics. Now, we are talking here also concerning developing countries, and if you want to invest in a public-private partnership or in your investment funds, you need some certainty on the long term. That means you have to have some judgment of the political stability in a country. So how are you going to invest or to suggest to invest in a country where the political scene is changing pretty rapidly? So how do you solve that? Because otherwise you cannot help through investment for these countries. That's one question. And then I have a second question, which is much easier, I guess. Who is controlling these investments, for example, for the public, for the pension funds? Who are these guys reporting to? Who is checking on that?
So I have, regarding the first question, regarding political risk, geopolitical risk is it's a big factor. There's certain kinds of risk that there's a lot of capital available for, and there's certain kinds of risk that there's very little capital available for. So think about from your point of view, a risk-return curve, where up on the top, it's very high risk, and it requires a high return to compensate for that risk. And very low, it's low risk, and you don't have to provide much return. Cash is low risk, low return, and venture capital would be high risk, high return. So among these funds, because they have obligations, even though they have massive capital, they don't really have a lot of capital available for high risk, high return type of investments. That kind of risk is better taken by certain kinds of government agencies, multilateral agencies, World Bank, IFC, development banks. And the role they can play is get involved in an early stage, make the projects investable, make them bankable, and mitigate the risk. They can move them down the curve. And once they move them down the curve, then you can free up other capital to get involved. The other way that they can do it is you see development banks let's say the AFDB in Africa, gets involved in a project, and for every $1 they put in, there should be $10 of outside capital getting involved in a project, so you can get some sort of leveraged impact. That provides comfort to the investors because, of course, the stakeholders of the AFDB are all the African governments themselves. So if they're investing in their own projects. And then a final way that we mitigate that risk is we're seeing in the sovereign fund community that guys are teaming up with other sovereign funds in local communities. So you'll see the guys investing in Uganda with the Uganda National Social Security Fund as their partner, because that gives them comfort of having a local partner who's involved, and that gives you some political protection. Or in Nigeria, you can work with the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, or so on. So these guys are pretty practiced in investing throughout the region. But you're right. You have to deal with those risks. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble.
So if I understand correctly, one key issue is collaboration, that you put several partners together.
Absolutely.
Correct.
A little bit.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Correct.
so that's like particle physics. So
Yeah, it's finance for peace. Okay.
okay, yeah.
So,
And the last question.
yeah, the last one is these are independent organizations, so they're not, the governments can't tell them you need to invest here or there. They have to be run independently. They have their own board of trustees. They have their own steering committees, which are typically appointed. So I used to run a sovereign fund. I actually ran the Korean Sovereign Wealth Fund. You can tell how Korean I look, but I was appointed to run that fund. And I had an independent board, which was comprised of a representative. I had two stakeholders, the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. So they had members on the board. And then I also had 7 other members from academia and from industry who were appointed. And so the board, we were accountable to the board. The board appointed the leadership of the organization and could hire and fire them. And they're responsible ultimately to the public.
Yeah, that's my biggest point.
Right. And the management is independent.
I think there are very interesting points which should be discussed during lunch.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will give you some quite generic remarks in the first stage, some macro observations. When my presentation will show up. And then I wanted to share with you some general remarks on key elements of success for PPPs, for private-public partnership in infrastructure projects. And then finally, talk about one example in Jordan, which is, if my information is right, considered as a success, which is the airport renovation and the extension of the airport in Amman. And finally, talk a little bit about my company, Airbus Group, which is not present yet in Jordan, but which develops cooperation with the University of Jordan in taking interns to the Airbus organization. So let's start with some general remarks. How to satisfy needs for infrastructure investment when public funds are short. Henry already mentioned it. Public governments have not the means, the money, and probably also the management power to address the needs of infrastructure investment. The global need, and here I have my source with McKinsey, the global needs for infrastructure investment are more than 49 trillion by 2030. This is a challenge. And if you look at Jordan, for instance, the GDP in 2016 was roughly 40 billion US dollar, with a government debt of 94%. And this shows that the means of the Jordan government to invest in infrastructure projects are not sufficient. When you look at the population, we have 9 million people in Jordan, and out of those, 30% are non-Jordanian, with 1.6 million Syrian refugees. And this is overwhelming the Jordan government. So, back to the investment in infrastructure. What are the obstacles we can see? Obstacles for private investment are the mobilization of capital over the long term. And as somebody rightly said, private investment expects quicker return. So you have to engage for a long time. How can you handle this? Projects are very often delayed. Philippe said also, you have given a couple of examples, or fail. Infrastructure requires stable and sustainable investment, and here Scott will come in, I think, with a couple of more information of that. PPPs for infrastructure development can be really a good solution if they are managed properly, and if the project is conceived and designed in a proper way. There can be innovative solutions and really bring hope for countries that are lacking means for realizing this. And one important thing I think that we all will say and underline again is that the benefits of the public-private partnership for the community must be measured over a very long term. Now I switch to a couple of lessons learned, and I think there are some lessons learned from Jordan itself. There are some best practices in Jordan that I have found in a couple of different experiences. First, you need government commitment. Henry already said it. There is in Jordan a sense of urgency to maximize privatization proceeds for paying down high-level debt. This is one thing. The other thing is that the urgency of handling these huge inflow of refugees is questioning the capacity of Jordan to respond in water treatment, in energy, in transportation, in roads, in a couple of things they need to do. Second, Jordan has shown that it has a clear strategy, which is another key for success. Jordan has a 2025 vision and strategy, and it has put in place a performance management framework for implementation. Priority sectors are clearly set and published: energy, transport, urban development, water, infrastructure, tourism, and ICT. And also, when you look at the refugee inflow, health services, and proper education. You need macroeconomic stability to attract foreign investment. And this is the case for Jordan. Programs with IMF and the neighbor states in the region to enhance growth and employment prospects are done. You need sufficient legal authority. We mentioned it yesterday already. Jordan has a privatization law published in 2000, and the Jordanian Investment Fund law published in 2016. And they have the power to enforce respect. Jordan has a centralized privatization agency. The Executive Privatization Commission is established, and it has enough budget and good staffing as well. And the staffing is local, which is another aspect, I think, for for success. You need efficient intergovernmental coordination because you need quick decisions. Sometimes a project, a huge project, has difficulties. Sometimes there are risks that it fails. So they need to quickly adapt and take decisions for increasing funding or put in place more specialized program management. Highly qualified external advisors. So those come in with the public funding organizations like IMF, World Bank, the European Investment Bank, International US Agency for International Development, or others. You have to put in place sufficient funding, realistic end-to-end global project plan and access to private funding. And there you need sometimes international organization to ease that. Sound project fundamentals, financial structuring, debt repayment structure and schedule. And this schedule must be adapted to the cash profile of your environment. Fair concession design, reasonable risk allocation and transparent bidding process. This is in your projects. I think I have understood that your experience was that this needs absolutely to be done. Flexible transaction structure, allowing to adapt during the implementation. If you need more funds, you need to be able to give them. The monitoring of the global impact over the long term, again, is one important aspect. And finally, you need patience. You need patience because those transactions take time. You can't expect to fix a huge infrastructure project just in 2 years. So, can I talk now about the one example? Is that okay? The Queen Alia International Airport, Amman. You nearly all of you came in, and you have seen this beautiful design, brand new airport. And it's currently a concession. It's a BOT, build, own, transfer project, with important stakes of the Jordan state still. Queen Alia Airport is considered for 3 years in a row as the best airport of its size in the Middle East, which is quite amazing and fantastic. It is a 25-year renovation expansion PPP, so public-private partnership project, co-financed by the IFC World Bank and the Islamic Development Bank. And those two have facilitated private investment. This project ran from 2007 to 2016. The airport was opened in 2013, but additional facilities have been finalized a little bit later. The bid was won. First, there was a bid, a very transparent and open bid. There are 5 consortiums answering the bid. And it was won by an international consortium, including a construction company and the construction group, the ADP, the French airport of Paris, and regional financial investors. The government was offered a 54 share of gross revenue over these 25 years. And it is foreseen still that after 5 years of exploitation, the ownership goes back to the Jordan government. The construction was completed 2 years later than foreseen, with some additional funding needs. And the global investment, if I'm not wrong, is something like $400 million. And this is quite a thing. The result of this, of the extension of the airport, is that there was a significant traffic growth of more than 9% in 2016. So 7.4 million tourists or passengers are going through this airport. And as a result is that this fluidity supports the development of the tourism in Jordan, which is a positive development aspect. And it is a success, we can consider it. I don't know if our Jordanian friends here in this room are agreeing with this. It has been well managed, this project, and it is really sustaining one of the priorities of the Jordan government to develop the economy of Jordan. So I stop here maybe, or some words about Airbus. Airbus Group is very present in the MENA, but not in Jordan. We are interested in Jordan because there is a very favorable business environment. You have a very attractive business park concept. You have well-educated young people, excellent engineers, and you push for new technologies and innovation. And your project, your wish is to, and we heard this yesterday, to push for knowledge-based economy. So why Airbus is not here? Why didn't we invest in this country yet? We have not found really aerospace capabilities. It's a quite small market, and we cannot deal with offset obligations here. And finally, the cost base is quite high for investing in a factory, or this is not really competitive now compared to Tunisia, for instance. So I wanted to close here just to open some doubts on the commitment of one of the big industrial groups in Europe. But I think we do something now with Jordan. We are signing an agreement with one of the big Jordanian universities to take interns to Airbus and to complete some training and to send them back. And probably in the mid or long term, we create more favorable conditions to invest here in Jordan. Thank you.